All right, let's get started. Introduce myself again. I'm George Ponchak. And some of you may know me if you ever submit a paper to one of the MTT transactions, as I was the editor for two of our journals. I served for 8 years as editor, 4 years for microwave and wireless component letters, and then 4 years for the transactions and microwave theory techniques. So I have a really good feel of how papers get accepted, why they get rejected, and how to work through the review process. On top of that, though, I serve on the editorial board for John Wiley Publications, so I know how they work. And while I was the editor, IEEE has meetings once a year where all the editors get together and we share comments and notes with each other. So I have a good feel of how all the IEEE journals work. And I've served on conference review boards and technical program committee chairs for numerous conferences. So I know how conference proceedings are put together and how those papers are reviewed. So the title may say, how to get your paper accepted for MTT-S journals and publications, but think of it as much broader. It's to help you with your solid-state circuits papers, your electron devices papers, your APMC conference papers. It applies to everything. Now, this is an MTT-S conference, and my only slide is specific to MTT-S, but in reality, every society has multiple journals. In our society, this is our oldest journal, the Transactions Microwave Theory Techniques. Dates back to the mid-1950s. Very prestigious journal. This journal here, it's another Transactions on Terahertz Science and Technology. It's new, it's 5 years old. Those two journals typically publish longer papers, 4 pages and longer. The letters are 3 pages and less. That is the only difference between those journals, is the length of the paper. They all have the same content, they're written the same way, they're reviewed the same way. When I was the editor of the letters, and a reviewer sent in the reviews and it said, well, it's okay for the letters. To me, that means it's a reject. The reviewer was trying to say it wasn't as good a paper, but if you want to take it for the letters, fine. That's not the way we treat it. The letters are quality papers, just like the transactions. And I always found writing a letters paper is probably really hard, because you're trying to condense your thoughts into 3 pages. So they're very hard to write. But that's the only difference between them. The magazine is a very good journal. I recommend writing magazine articles. It's where we want to put articles that are not written at the expert level. They're written more for the practicing engineers, so everybody in our society can understand them. You don't have to be the filter expert in the world to understand the filter paper. It's supposed to be understandable to more people. So they're more of review articles and tutorial articles. Now, if you really want to write an expert level review article or an expert level tutorial article, you can submit that to the transactions and they would love to get that paper. Unfortunately, though, we haven't gotten those kind of papers in many years now, but they really would like it if you wanted to write one of those papers. Every society typically has multiple journals like this, and they all have the same criteria. Letters, shorter papers, transactions or longer papers. In addition to those journals, the MTT-S and the APE, the Attention Propagation Society and Electromagnetic Compatibility Society started a new journal on multi-scale and multi-physics computational techniques. It's a new journal, it just started. It's not going to be print, it's only electronic, but it is an area to publish papers in this topic area. Brand new journal, you might want to consider publishing there. Now, why write for IEEE journals? And you probably can generalize this, but impact factor. Who in here knows what impact factor is? Raise your hand. See, who raised their hands was mostly the senior people and the professors, because they really know what impact factor is. The students will learn very quickly, because your professors will tell you, you must publish in a journal with high impact factor. Impact factor is a measure of how often your paper is cited if it's in a journal. And it's an average, it's for the journal. It's not specific to your paper. But many institutions, many libraries treat it as a judge of the quality of the paper. And all it means is, for example, if the journal has an impact factor of 2, the average paper published in that journal will be cited 2 times over the next 2 years. That's all the impact factor means. But, as I said, institutions put a very high value on high impact factor journals. You really can't compare journals in engineering to journals in biomedicine, for example, the medical field. Those journals have impact factors of 10, 20. Nature is really high. In engineering, though, if you have an impact factor of journal solid-state circuits of 3, that's very good. That's one of the highest IEEE impact factors. But the way to treat it is, and I've talked to many people, you submit your paper to the journal with the highest impact factor. That's typically what people do. They hope it gets accepted. And if it doesn't, they say, okay, I'll go down one. I'll submit it maybe to one of these other journals, like electronic letters. Now, electronic letters has very quick turnaround time. I know many people submit their papers there just because they publish like in 6 weeks. But the impact factor is a little bit lower, but it does have value because your paper is published really quick. And if it's rejected, you get down to the John Wiley publications, 0.6. Now, surprisingly, I'm on the board, I said, of some of these John Wiley publications, and they only have impact factors of 0.6. But don't think that the acceptance rate of those journals is high. The acceptance rate is higher just because the impact factor is low. The acceptance rate for John Wiley publication I work with, the acceptance rate is actually lower than it is for our transactions. So don't think you can send them your poor quality papers without accept them. They won't. Another reason to publish in IEEE is open access. How many in here are being told that you have to publish in open access? Many governments now are saying open access. I work for the US government. They're saying now all of our papers have to be open access. In Europe, open access is getting to be a very big thing. There are many open access journals, pure open access. You pay them $3,000, they'll publish your paper. The review process for some of them is very good. For others, it's not so good. Some of them have a very high impact factor, but there's some debate over if that impact factor was earned or if it was achieved by manipulation. IEEE journals are all open access. You may not have known that, but if you pay an open access fee, no matter who you are in the world, no matter what society you belong to, your paper can be open access. So if you really have to publish open access, send it to our normal journals and just say you want to be open access, you pay a fee. It's about comparable to the page charge fees that you normally would have paid anyway, and your paper be open access. So now we get into really the meat of this talk. And if you understand this slide, I can stop right now and go eat breakfast. Because this slide tells everything about why your papers are being accepted or rejected, and the whole review process is why we write papers. The scientific process. Now, we all are probably engineers by trade, but if you're writing papers and you really care more about understanding why something works or how something works, that's kind of science, so I call it the scientific process. In the scientific process, put down by Galileo many years ago, an engineer or scientist comes up with a hypothesis of a thought, then they go in the lab and they test that hypothesis and they see if it works. If it doesn't, they revise their hypothesis, they work on it, go back in the lab, redo the experiments, and if it works, then they would write. Now, Galileo wrote books. In the old days, they didn't write papers, they didn't have journals like we do now. They didn't have the internet, obviously, but they wrote books. But, let's go to modern times, and we'll write journal articles like we do now, or conference papers like we do now. So the scientific process is used for publishing new scientific results. We want that it's important for a scientific process to publish those results so other people can build on those results, confirm your results. If you write a paper, you're essentially telling the world, this is what I believe to be true. People in their labs should try to duplicate your results. And if they can't duplicate it, what happens? They write a letter to the editor, it goes in the back of the transactions, and it'll say, I tried to duplicate the experiment that George Ponchak described in his paper, and I couldn't. And I think he may have done something wrong. He's making a wrong conclusion. We've all seen that happen throughout history, right? Cold fusion was an example. Everybody thought, it was demonstrated. Nobody can duplicate the results. So we write papers to allow other people to confirm results. We write papers to allow other researchers to extend your results. The second one. Again, if I present a paper at a conference like this, there's 200 people in the audience. They all work with research groups of maybe about 10 people. So they all go home, they all listen to me, and they all go home then. So I'm talking to really about 2,000 people with their extended research groups. Now I may know what the next step is in the process I'm going to follow. But what's the odds of me going back to my lab and continuing to plod along, trying to complete my work, and beating 2,000 other very smart engineers to the next step? And maybe I make a mistake. I don't really have the next step fully developed in my mind. Maybe I think I do, but it's not right. It's 2,000 people in the audience, they'll get it right. Somebody will get it right. So science progresses a lot faster when you publish your results. The last reason we publish is to clarify difficult concepts for engineers and scientists. Who in here knows Maxwell's equations? Everybody, right? How many of them are there? 4, right? That's what we learned. Read Maxwell's book. You will not see those 4 equations. You will see 20 equations. Incomprehensible to me. I looked at them. I could not understand them. However, Heaviside looked at Maxwell's equations. However, Heaviside developed vector calculus and wrote down Maxwell's equations that we know. And that really helped the world. And by writing it down in that simplified form, Alfred Heaviside was able to develop things like the skin depth and transmission line equations. So clarifying a difficult concept allowed all of us to really work with Maxwell's equations and do so much more. Then there's personal reasons. It had nothing to do with the scientific process. Establish priority. Many of you keep very good notebooks. I'm a lousy notebook taker. I have scraps of paper and folders on my desk, and I jot down notes on it as I'm working. But whether it's that folder with scraps of notes in it, or files on your computer, or a really detailed notebook, that does not establish your priority. When you publish, you establish your priority. Who developed calculus? Newton or Leibniz? It's a debate that went on through history. It was a very nasty debate at the time. Newton, now through history, we know that Newton developed calculus first. Leibniz developed it independently at the same time, but published it first. It was a very nasty debate at the time. It could have been solved if Newton had published his results first. But Newton was a type that didn't like to publish because he was getting in conflicts with a gentleman named Robert Hooke. So he didn't want to publish because he had conflicts with Robert Hooke, who also didn't like to publish. So they had lots of arguments. The only good thing that came out of all those arguments at the time was that scientists realized we should publish as soon as we develop something and stop all these arguments. And you want to do that. Establish your priority. You want to publicize your results. Think of publicize as advertise. You're working at a university, you're working at a company, and you want the world to know that if you want to fund research in that topic that you're working on, you want the world to know that you're the ones working there. In the 1980s, when I started at NASA, I was developing contracts to develop, we called them MMICs, now you call them RFICs. But anyway, I wanted to develop a contract to develop a low noise amplifier on indium phosphide. So I looked in the literature, I saw what companies were working on the topic. I visited a few of those companies, I wrote the specifications for the contract, and we got in some bids and awarded the contract. And then a different company I didn't visit, came to us and said, why didn't you talk to us? We're doing the best research in indium phosphide. I said, look, I didn't know you were even working in this field. I looked through all the journals, I looked through all the conference proceedings, your company never came up. They started publicizing after that, they started writing papers, and they started winning contracts. So it's important that you publicize your work. Finally, career advancement. If you work at a company, I know some companies pay their employees $500 if you write a paper, sometimes $1,000. That's a form of career advancement, right? They're giving you a cash bonus. If you're a student, you may have been told by your professor, you want your master's, you have to write at least 2 papers. You want your PhD, you have to write at least 6 papers in a journal. Form of career advancement. You want your degree, you write papers. Professors are told you want tenure, you have to have a lot of papers in high impact factor journals. Form of career advancement. So career advancement is another reason to write. On this slide, it's what I like to think of as basically the history of microwave engineering. But look at the people up here. Savart and Bayat. They started working on forces between magnets and currents traveling on wires. And Andre Lamprey was intrigued by their work, and he started working on it. And he developed far better experimental confirmation of that. And he was a good mathematician also, so he developed what we call Ampere's law now. Michael Faraday was aware of Ampere's work, and he was intrigued by it, and he realized there must be a corollary. So he started working on electromagnetic induction, and he gave us Faraday's law. Now, Faraday was an untrained mathematician. He was not a mathematician at all, but he was an excellent experimentalist. He was my favorite experimentalist in the world. And his notebooks were enough that when Maxwell read his notebooks, he could see exactly what the equations should look like to describe that Faraday's law. Then Heinrich Hertz saw Maxwell's equations and confirmed the idea that electromagnetic waves propagate the speed of light, and verified Maxwell's equation. And then, like I said, Oliver Heaviside saw Maxwell's equations, worked with them extensively, and gave them to us in a form that we know now. But look at the dates, 1820 to 1885, 1893. This all happened in a short period of time. What would have happened if one of these gentlemen had not published? Now, it's true, there's 1 billion people in the world at the time, maybe more. Somebody probably would have worked this out, but maybe it was a 10-year delay, maybe a 20-year delay. Maxwell, everybody considers to be a real genius, right? But what happens is Faraday and Ampere hadn't done their work before Maxwell unfortunately died young. We would have had to wait 20, 30 years maybe for him to come along and give it that. Science would have been slowed up if these gentlemen had not published. So, publish so science can keep progressing. Okay, so you're a scientist, you're an engineer, and you're working on something, you have to write. Now, I don't know about you, if I'm doing math or I'm writing computer code, yes, I sit at my desk. I mean, where else can you solve integral equations or algebra except sitting at your desk? I'm not the type I can do algebra in my head. But if you have to do something as creative, you have to think of a creative solution, I often do that while I'm cutting the grass or bike riding. You know, in other words, most creative thought does not happen while you're sitting staring at a piece of paper. It pops in your head when you're doing something else. When that happens, I get home, if I'm out bike riding and an idea pops in my head, first thing you do is a literature search. Because why would you want to waste your time developing something if it's already been done? So do a literature search first. It's so easy for you nowadays. You know, it's not like in the 1980s when I started, I would have to go to the library and leaf through every journal, the December issue of every journal, because that's where the index was, look at the keywords, and then go to the next year. I would spend days in the library. Now you go into Google Scholar, you type in a few keywords, come up with 10,000 hits, and then you got to weed through them and figure out which ones really apply to you. But do the literature search first, so you don't waste a lot of time and money developing something that maybe has been done a long time already. If it hasn't been done, then you develop your technology. Then you go in your lab, you work out the experiments, or you sit at your computer, you write your computer code and solve your new numerical method you develop, whatever it is. And it all works out, and then you have to say, okay, I'm going to submit this to a conference. You decide what conference you're going to send it to. And that's just a matter of finding which conference is within the scope of what you're working on, right? If it's microwave engineering, you might want to send it to the International Microwave Symposium, or the Radio and Wireless Symposium, right? European Microwave Conference. You want to pick a conference that fits your scope. You write your paper, and you submit your paper. Now, one reason why you want to decide the conference before you start writing the paper is every conference has different formats for their papers. Maybe it's only 2 pages. I was just at a conference that was up to 12 pages. It was almost like writing a journal article. So you want to understand that requirements before you write your paper. And you submit your paper, and it goes to, from your point of view, it would be like going to a black hole, because you don't know what happened. You threw it out there, and you just got sucked in. But what happens is there's a group of people like myself sitting around a table, and there's like 10 of us, and we've read the papers and we're going through them and stacking them and ranking them, and we decide which ones are acceptable and which ones are rejected. Sometimes that happens electronically, we do it over the internet. Other times, like for this conference, International Microwave Symposium, we all get together in person and we discuss them. But it all happens really quickly, like within hours while we're sitting around a table. And you will get a letter back saying your paper is accepted or rejected. You won't be given any reasons why it's rejected. You won't be given any reasons why it was accepted. You just get a letter back saying it's accepted or rejected. And there's no chance for revisions. There's no chance to argue the decision. And all that is because conferences happen on a quick time, right? You submit your paper, the conference is only 4 months later. We don't have time to debate with you why your paper was good or not good. So that's conferences. Journals are totally different. Same process of developing your technology and doing your literature search, that's all the same. But instead of deciding what conference you're going to submit your paper to, you decide what journal you're going to submit your paper to. Now, how do you do that? Well, you did your literature search. Which journals were most of the papers in that came up with similar keywords? That's probably an indication that those are the journals you may want to consider submitting to. The reason to decide which journal you're going to submit to, again, is just like conferences are all different. If I take 2 IEEE papers, they all look the same, right? 2-column format, title at the top. If I take them on the wall, I stand 5 feet away, my eyes aren't as good as they used to be, I can't really read them, they all look the same. Every paper looks the same. But if you read them, they're different. Some journals require experimental confirmation, some don't. Some require in-depth discussion of why a circuit worked or how it worked, others don't. They only require a photograph of the circuit and measured results. So you have to decide which journal you're writing. You have to understand the philosophy of the editors for that journal and what they expect. So when you write your paper, you write for that journal. You write your paper, you submit your paper. Who's the first person that sees that paper? Every editor has an assistant or a secretary. This assistant is not an engineer. They only are there to assist the editor handle this great mass of papers that come in every month. For the journals that I was talking about, the MTT journals, we get about 100 to 130 papers a month. So the editor needs somebody to log them in and help deal with all the emails from authors and so forth. She will look at the paper. In my case, it was a she. I had a female assistant. She looks at the paper and sees if it's in a 2-column format, if the figures are interspersed throughout the paper, and there was references. That's all she looked at. If it didn't have those things, she sent a letter back to the author saying your paper is not in the right format, rewrite it. It's not a reject because it never really got to me yet, but what it is for you is a big delay because it took her maybe a week to look at the paper, and then she has to send it back to you, and it maybe takes you a month then to reformat the paper, resubmit it, so you might lose 4 to 6 weeks. It's not a reject, but it's a big delay. If it gets past the assistant, then it goes to the editor. First thing as an editor I did is I looked to see if it's within the scope of my journal. I worked for the Microtheory Technique Society. If you sent me a paper on a passive antenna, maybe a microstrip patch antenna on Durite, no electronics connected to it, no feed network, it's just the patch antenna, I would reject it until you send it to Transactions, Antennas, and Propagation. That's an antenna paper. You sent it to the wrong journal. If you send it to the right journal, then I look to see if you had sufficient technical content. Now that's a hard one, but IEEE allows us, the editors, to look at and see if it has sufficient technical content. Now what do I mean by that? Say you're working on a filter, a bandpass filter, and you show the transmission coefficients, and you show that you have nice transmission coefficient. The filter obviously must be good, but you don't give us the return coefficient. So what happened to the rest of the power? Right? Because the power is a sum of the transmission and the reflected powers. I don't know what happened. Maybe it's all radiated, maybe it's lost, I don't know. That's insufficient technical content. The reviewers cannot review that paper. So I would send it back to you and say, give us the rest of the results. We can't review this paper as it was submitted. If you get past those 2 hurdles, and believe me, 95% of papers get past those 2 hurdles. Most authors are intelligent enough that this is not a problem. I then send it to an associate editor. Associate editors are the ones who then handle the paper. They send it to the reviewers. And we have different associate editors. Every journal has different associate editors based on topics. We have associate editors that handle filter papers. We have associate editors that handle numerical methods papers. And associate editors that handle RFIC papers. So we send it to the right associate editor so your paper can be handled by an expert in the field. And then they send it to experts in the field to review. And then they get the reviews back. Now, a good associate editor then will take those reviews back, and they will have read the paper also, and they will write a recommendation to the editor. I recommend this paper be rejected for the following reasons, and here's the reviewer's comments. Or I recommend this paper be accepted for this reason, and here's the reviewer's comment. The editor then makes the decision. Now, in some societies, the associate editor makes the final decision to accept or reject your paper. In our society, it's not. It's the editor who makes the final decision. But you have to understand this. In IEEE rules, the editor is always responsible for the decision. If you ever don't like the decision, you write a letter to the editor, say, I don't like this decision, and they say, go talk to the associate editor, say, no, I'm talking to you. You're the editor. You are responsible for this decision. I always, when I was the editor, read the recommendations from the associate editor, I read all the reviews, and I reviewed every paper myself also. And then I made the decision to accept or reject the paper. And when I started as an editor, one of the past editors, a good friend of mine, said, George, you have to remember one thing. This is not a democracy. If 3 people say accept the paper and 1 says reject, it's not accept. If 3 say reject and nobody says accept, and you still think it's a good paper, you can accept it. It's not a democracy. It's kind of like a dictatorship in that sense, but the editor is making decisions based on different things. Now, I have a good reason why I want to accept a paper that reviewers thought was bad, or reject a paper that reviewers thought was good. But that's the editor's prerogative to do that. If your paper is rejected, you know what happens. You get a letter back, says your paper is rejected. You should be given the associate editor's comments. You should be given all the reviewers' comments. They may be slightly edited. Sometimes reviewers are impolite in what they write, so a good editor will delete those impolite things. And then you should get a letter back from the editor of why your paper is rejected. And you will get that, and you can work with it. If your paper is accepted, it's probably going to be accepted with major or minor revisions. And And the reason I say that is in all my years, I only had one paper was accepted on the first time that was accepted with no revisions. It was beautifully written. There was not even a comma out of place. But that's only one out of tens of thousands of papers that I worked with. Your paper will require revisions. You will be sent this. You should try to get your revisions done within a month, and you resubmit the paper. And then the editor will look at those and see if the paper is acceptable or not. Now I said, we've already outlined for you what you have to fix on your paper. So it should be easy for you to fix everything. And I'll cover a little bit later of how you can guide the editor to see that you fixed everything. Now every once in a while, I did get an author who resubmitted the paper saying, no, my paper was written perfectly the first time, accept it the way I submitted it. And then I unfortunately have to reject the paper and say, I'm sorry, no, you have to address these comments. But most authors are reasonable. They know that they should tell the editor, I know better than you. Finally, at that point, the paper gets submitted to IEEE, assuming it's all accepted, it gets submitted to IEEE. I, or my assistant, would send it to IEEE for publishing. At that point, as an editor, I have already read your paper 3 times. Some other editors, maybe you've only read it once or twice, but whatever, they've read your paper, they don't want to see it again. They're tired of it. They have 100 other papers that were submitted that month they had to work on it. But what happens when IEEE sends you your galley proofs? And any journal you send you to, they're going to send you galley proofs to check the paper. When you send your paper to IEEE, you think it's perfect. The editor said it's acceptable. But IEEE and any other journal hires technical editors. And these are not engineers, they're not scientists, they're just editors. And they think they're fixing things. They think they're correcting some grammar. But often they change the meaning of a sentence. And that changes, sometimes it's wrong. And I've had authors call me up and say, George, they changed my paper, it's all wrong now, and it's in Explore wrong. I said, did you read the gallery proofs? They said, no. I said, I can't do anything. When it's published, I can't do anything. All you can do at this point is write a letter to the editor, which will go into the back of a journal later on, stating what the errors are in the paper. And they'll usually say something like, due to typographical errors or something, there was an error in equation 3 or something like that. But I cannot fix your paper once it's on Explore, once it's on the internet. We all know that. So read your gallery proofs. That's very important. So observations on return papers, they mostly happen because you did not follow the policies of the journal. It wasn't within the scope of the journal. You didn't have sufficient technical content. There's really no reason for those. It doesn't happen all that often, but try to avoid those. So reasons for rejection of reviewed papers. Notice the title. It doesn't say reasons for acceptance of reviewed papers. The reason is I've probably read 40, 50,000 reviews. Conference papers, journal papers. I guarantee you not one reviewer ever read your paper looking for reasons to accept it. They all look for reasons to reject your paper. And once they think they found enough reasons to reject your paper, they stop reading and write the editor a letter saying, reject this paper. And here's my 3 reasons I found. Your goal as an author is not to give them reasons to stop reading your paper. Your goal is to get them to read the last line of the paper, not to give them those easy reasons to reject your paper. And I'll cover these now. So reason number 1 for stop reading, not referencing your prior papers. If you're working on a topic and you've published maybe 4 papers on this topic already, and you're submitting your 5th paper, and you don't reference your other 4 papers, and it's very similar papers, when a reviewer finds that you've already published 4 papers, they're not going to spend the time to read those 4 papers, read your current paper that you just submitted, and try to understand if there's a difference between them. They will instead say, this author's already published this work, reject it. You have to be careful in your introduction to explain how this new submission is different than those other 4 papers. So you get to reference those other 4 papers and cite in the introduction how this new work is different. So not referencing your prior work that's similar almost always causes a rejection. You also want to be fair in referencing other people's work. Nobody develops everything on their own. We all build on other people's work. We all build on our own work. So you want to be fair in referencing other people's work. Now, that means don't only reference papers by your institution either. Your institution may be great. It may be the top institution in the world on a particular topic. But there's lots of institutions in the world and lots of engineers and scientists collaborating and working on that same topic. And some of them may have provided key steps to the development of that technology. And you should reference that work. One reason why you definitely want to do that is who am I going to send your paper out to be reviewed by? I'm not going to send it to you. I'm not going to send it to your institution because that would be unethical if I asked your institution to review work by the guy in the next office. I'm going to send it to somebody else in the world who's working on that same topic. And if I find somebody, who's working in a different institution as maybe I think one of the leaders in this topic area, and he reads this paper that you submitted, and you don't acknowledge any of his groundbreaking work in the field, that reviewer is probably going to look and say, this person's not aware of the state of the art in the field, reject the paper. Make sure that the author references everybody fairly and realizes that this is not really state of the art. So be careful when you reference it. With Explore now and Google Scholar, and I use Google Scholar very much, I use it almost extensively, we will find all prior works that you've published. Every time you submit a paper to me, I always searched on your name and I searched on the topic to see what's been published before. Low novelty. This is really up to the editor to decide what is low novelty, but we have help from the reviewers also. They tell us what if they think it's low novelty. We don't like to publish papers that duplicate what other people have already done. As a society, we have to pay money for the page charges. We pay money for the editors and the IEEE staff to edit every paper. It costs money. We don't want to waste the reviewer's time. We don't want to waste the reader's time. And people at home who have to pay to download a paper, they really don't like to download a paper that duplicates what other people have already done. So we will look to see that your paper is new. You're publishing new results. And that does not mean the introduction is longer and you threw in a few more references. I often are asked, I presented a paper at a conference such as this one, and I then resubmitted it to the journal afterwards because we're invited to resubmit a longer paper to the journal, and it was rejected. And I looked at it and said, yes, you expanded the introduction by 2 pages, you threw in 30 more references, but all the technical content is the same. It's low novelty. I could read the conference paper, understand exactly what you've done. It's all there already. So you really have to expand the technical content, and that's what I mean here by low novelty. It has to be significant. And this is totally up to the editor to decide what is significant. I made up a fictitious title of a paper here. The development of a numerical method that merges Cartesian and circular coordinate systems for the solution of snow cone waveguide. Now, I'm not a numerical methods person, but there may be a great advantage to merging those two into a single solution basis. But is anybody in the world ever going to do snow cone waveguide? No. This is not significant work. It will get rejected. The numerical method, the theory behind it may be great. Maybe that should be published, but it will not get published because of snow cone waveguide. So make sure your work is significant. Work on topics that people care about. Not state of the art. We don't want to publish work that is not state of the art. When I started working at NASA, those contracts I mentioned before, these were multi-million-dollar contracts extending over 3 years. One of the ones that I had was to develop a low noise amplifier on gallium arsenide. The final chip was at 30 gigahertz, roughly. It had 2 transistors, so microstub matching networks, and it was 3 millimeters by 5 millimeters. It was state-of-the-art in 1985. It cost the government $3 million to develop this chip. But now, if you're going to develop a low noise amplifier, it's probably going to be on CMOS. It will have thermal control circuits, it will have bias control circuits, all built into it, and it will be less than a millimeter by millimeter, and it will have better performance. So why would you compare your new low noise amplifier to something in 1985 that is, we laugh when we look at it now. Compare your work to state-of-the-art. All the reviewers are experts in the field, and they don't like to read papers that is not state-of-the-art. Unsupported claims. I had a paper that was submitted to me, and it was on MEMS, RF MEMS. And it was questionable quality. It was an okay MEMS switch, but not great. And when the person got to the conclusions, they tried to claim that because of this switch, now mixers and phase shifters and all kinds of circuits could be developed by their company. In other words, the author was trying to claim the whole area of RF MEMS for their company based on this one paper and excluding anybody else from publishing in that area. That's an unsupported claim that definitely the work in this paper did not support. We often find this in the introductions, because in the introductions, we tend to get a little creative. We tend to like to oversell, actually, the paper to the reviewers, to the readers, by stating that everything that's been done in the past is wrong. In other words, prior numerical methods required too much memory, took too long to run, the CPU time was too long. They were not accurate enough. They only had 3 digits accuracy and they needed 6. They list all these things that was wrong with everything else, and then they write the paper and they submit it, and the reader gets to the end of the paper and says, my gosh, the author never talked about the CPU time, never talked about the memory usage, so the paper gets rejected because unsupported claims. Because you may not have meant to claim that you were going to beat all these metrics. You may have been thinking you were just stating some general observations, but to an editor, to a reader, you were claiming in that introduction that you were going to fix all these problems. And we get to the back of the paper and you didn't. So that's an unsupported claim that your paper will get rejected for. Method of the circuit is not fully explained. Remember on that slide I said if you understand it, you understand the whole talk I'm going to give? If you write a paper, somebody has to be able to duplicate, verify your results. If you don't explain it, how can they duplicate it? How can they verify it? Read Michael Faraday's books. They're beautiful. The exact description of everything in the lab that had to do with that experiment. Anybody can duplicate exactly what he did in their lab nowadays. Your goal should be to write papers like that. If you have a paper, you design a circuit, for example, we will insist that you give the lengths and the impedances of all the circuit elements, or you give the physical dimensions of all the circuit component elements, so that somebody can duplicate that circuit. If it's a numerical method, you should give enough of the equations that somebody could program a computer and verify that your method works. Now, we all are reasonable. We all understand that if you developed a very complicated RFIC, that nowadays are very complicated, hundreds and thousands of transistors, tens of thousands, and if you give the schematic, I in my lab will not be able to duplicate that circuit. I understand that, because every foundry is different. Even though you've given me your schematic, and I take it to the people in my foundry, I will not be able to duplicate those results. Because my foundry, the transistor characteristics will be a little bit different. The parasitics between elements will be a little bit different. So I won't be able to duplicate it. But if I have your schematic, I have a good starting point. I can modify it to fit, I can modify the element values to fit our foundry and try to duplicate it. So you have to give enough that people can duplicate your work. Also, you should try to explain how your circuit works, why the new circuit works better. And this is different for different journals. Our journal, if you send in a low noise amplifier, for example, and you added an inductor and a feedback loop, and you got a small improvement in noise figure because of that, we will insist that you tell us why that inductor improved your noise figure, how it improved the circuit. Journal solid-state circuits will not require an in-depth explanation of why that inductor worked. Both journals want the schematic, both journals want the photograph of the circuit, both want the simulated and measured results of that circuit, but our journal insists that you go one step further and explain how that circuit worked better. Measured results are not presented. Our journals typically require measured results to verify simulations. So papers on passive components, filters, RFICs, systems, measurement techniques, we require measured results to verify that the thing works. The journal solid-state circuits, very similar. You would not get a paper except that journal solid-state circuits about measured results. If you send me a paper on a circuit or a system that does not have measured results, I will reject it, and I will say, submit it to the transactions on circuits and systems. They will accept your paper with just simulations. And, and depending on the topic area, I may guide you to a different journal that accepts papers by simulations. Now, there's two exceptions to this. We do not require experimental verification, and we're very clear about this because there's perception that we are too harsh in the MTT, and we reject every paper. But we do not reject papers if it's on theory or numerical methods just because it doesn't have experimental confirmation. If Maxwell had submitted his treatise to the editor of the transactions in MTT, it should have got accepted without waiting for Heinrich Hertz to verify it. Now, the editor may not have accepted it for other reasons, maybe he didn't understand it, but ideally, the editor would have accepted the paper, right? Numerical methods, same thing. You don't have to verify it with experimental, but you should compare it to an independent method to show that your numerical method gives you the same or the right solution and gives it to you in a quicker time or with less memory usage. So you have to compare it to a comparable method. Poor grammar. IEEE allows us to reject any paper because of poor grammar. Now, as an editor, I only rejected one paper because of poor grammar. And that's because the paper was so poorly written, I couldn't understand even the abstracts. I didn't even know what associated I sent it to. Well, we will work with you, typically. When I was the editor of the letters, again, it was only 3-page papers, I received a paper, and technically it was excellent work. But the grammar was horrible. And I was working on it with my red pen, and after a while I just gave up. And it was 10 at night, and the gentleman's on the other side of the world where the paper came from. I sent the paper back, or I sent him an email. I said, send me the Word version of your paper. He sent me a Word version. I rewrote the paper, I sent it back, and I said, is this what you meant? He said, yes. That's actually the paper that got published, was my text, but his figures and everything. Now, not every editor will do that, but our society and other societies will pay people to help you write your paper better if need be. Now, the bad thing, though, is I said, we will still review a paper if it's written poorly, and we'll try to help you. But what happens if you write your paper poorly? I had to struggle to understand every sentence. I have my red pen out, I'm trying to correct every sentence. And because I'm doing that, I'm thinking about the technical content also, really in depth, really studying the technical content. So I'm going to find every error in the technical content while I'm studying the grammar errors. And so your paper has a higher chance of being rejected because I'm studying it so more closely. If your paper is written beautifully, think about a novel you're reading on the airplane on the way here. You're reading it, you're flipping through the pages, you're not really thinking too much about the content, you're just reading to pass time. If the paper is written very well, I find myself doing that even when I'm reading an IEEE transaction paper. I get to the bottom of the page, I realize, George, I better go back to the top because I'm not really aware of what I just read. I read a whole page of text. It was nicely written, but I'm not sure what I read. It's sad to say, but papers that are written that way get accepted at a higher rate, and they may have technical errors because of that. So your goal is to avoid those easy rejections. So every paper, when you're writing it, has the same format. Title, abstract, introduction, technical content, conclusions, references. The abstract. It should be 50 to 250 words. Some IEEE journals have a standard format you must follow. IEEE tried to enforce that in every society. I pushed back, I said, no, our authors know how to do this, we're not going to follow an exact format. But your first or your third sentence should tell what problem is being investigated. Then you may have a sentence or two of how you perform the investigation, and then a sentence on the accomplishments. Not every accomplishment, but just the key points. Our power amplifier had 10 dB gain and delivered 30 milliwatts, whatever it was. One sentence on that. And why is your abstract so important nowadays? Well, what can you buy for free on the internet? You do your keyword search on Google Scholar, you're given the title and the abstract. Their abstract is now how you're publicizing your paper, how you're advertising your paper. This abstract is going to try to convince the reader to click the next button to download the full paper. Now, if you're working at work or you're in a university that has maybe every paper paid for, whether it's John Wiley or IEEE or whatever, it's easy to click the next button. You don't think about it. The institution's paying the $30 to download the paper. But if you're at home and it's out of your wallet, are you really going to pay $30 if you really don't think that abstract is going to help you? No. So write your abstract to sell your paper. The introduction. I consider the introduction to be the hardest part of the paper to write because it, again, is selling your paper. It's just a longer version of the abstract, but it has the additional thing that after you use the first paragraph to state the problem and why it was important, the next few paragraphs are going to compare your paper to the state of the art. And that's where you probably use every reference. And you are going to convince the reader then that why this problem is not totally solved yet and why your paper is required. Now you have to be careful in this section with the references. And I've seen this a lot lately. But when you reference fairly and reference politely. In other words, and I've seen this more often recently in the last 5 years, say, if you're writing a paper on coplanar waveguides, for example. At one time, I was writing a lot of coplanar waveguides. It's just a transmission line. And I wrote some papers. And so now an author is writing a paper, and they may write, George Ponchak in reference 3 wrote an equivalent circuit model for a coplanar waveguide T-junction that was so simple it's useless to the practicing engineer. That's a very impolite way of writing. Reference 3 has a simplified model for the CPW T-junction. They both say the same thing. One's written very politely, one's written impolitely. Try to write the polite way. And why is that important? Well, who's going to review your paper? I'm an expert in that field. Their editor is probably going to send me your paper to review. And how am I going to feel if on the second paragraph of the paper you just insulted me and called me a simpleton who doesn't understand microwave engineering enough to write a good model for a coplanar waveguide T-junction? I'm not going to be happy. So when I was the editor, if I saw that kind of writing in the introduction, I often just sent it back to the author before I even sent it for review. I said, I highly recommend you change this words because you're going to offend all the reviewers. The last paragraph of the introduction should, again, like the abstract, state what you accomplished in the paper and how you did it, very succinctly. Now, it's very sad to say, I know a very senior person of this society, MTT, and he told me one time, by the time he gets to his last sentence of the introduction, he's already made up his mind to accept or reject your paper. In other words, if you could not convince him by that sentence that your paper was worth reading, he basically stopped. It's a very sad statement, but there's a lot of reviewers that believe that. The rest of the paper, the organization, This is where you're going to explain your procedure, explain your experimental setup, derive your equations, run your simulations, show your measured results. This is the easy part. Everybody in here has no problem writing this part because you just spent a year of your life, maybe longer, working on this part. You have a notebook full of notes, a computer full of files. All you're doing now is summarizing it down into a few columns of text. That's easy. At the end of the paper, you have a summary or conclusion. If the paper is very long, you may break the paper into sections. And at the end of the section, if the paper is even really long, the sections are long, you might want to put a concluding sentence. Because sometimes readers don't want to sit down and spend 3 hours reading the paper in one sitting, so they may just put a sticky note where they stop reading, and a concluding sentence, that section may help them the next time you pick up the paper. But I guarantee you, everybody in this room, if I gave you this text, it's one of my papers, if I gave you this figure with the caption, these two figures with the caption, you probably couldn't write all this text. This is the easy part for all of us. Your references. I already stated your references should be used to put your paper in the state of the art so that people understand where you stand compared to other papers that are doing the same thing. But the references also do other things. They put your paper in context with the older references, but it also provides supplemental information. Who in here has written a paper and referenced Maxwell? Nobody. Who in here has referenced Heaviside? Nobody. If you're writing a paper on Copeland and waveguide, who referenced C.P. Wen's paper from the mid-1960s on Copeland and waveguide? Nobody. I stopped doing it after a while. We all get to assume at some point that these papers and these concepts were just delivered to us by nature, and we just accept them as gifts from nature. But they all really came from somebody. If you wanted to be really true, we should be referencing these prior works. In medical fields, one reason why they have very high impact factors is because you read the references for a medical journal, there's hundreds and hundreds of references for a 20-page paper. Our journals typically have 10, 12 references, maybe 20. But you should reference prior works to put your paper in context. And I'm not saying you have to reference Maxwell or Heaviside, but don't be too skimpy on your references. A helpful hint, in fact, it's not a hint, I really highly recommend it. Some of your references must come from the journal you're submitting to. That does two things. It convinces the editor that you're within the scope, you're publishing a paper within the scope of that journal. If I received a paper that all the references were for transactions on tensor propagation and none to my journal, that's a clue to me of two things. One, the paper is not within the scope of my journal. And two, you might have submitted it there, it was rejected from there, and you didn't even want to spend the time to reformat it from my journal, you sent it to me. So, reference papers from that journal. The other reason you want to do that is, I mentioned before, impact factor is important, and it's actually given too much importance, but editors look to ways, unethical ways, of increasing their impact factor. And an unethical way that I can guarantee my journal an impact factor of 4, for example, so I would say, you submit a paper to me, you want me to accept it, reference 4 papers from my journal I've published over the last 2 years. I'll accept it. My impact factor now is 4, if I do it to every one of you. That's an unethical thing. If an editor ever does that to you, complain. Now, if an editor sends you a list of references, and I did this often, when I did my searches, I would just send 5 references I really thought should have been referenced. And I said, here's some references that you may want to consider adding to your paper because they are really state-of-the-art results. And they weren't always to my journal. It was whatever 5 that I found that I thought were really going to help your paper. That's legitimate. That's an ethical thing for the editor to do. But if I'm trying to increase my impact factor, and that's my only goal, that's unethical. If you report me to IEEE, they'll fire me as an editor. Before your submission, have all your co-authors read the paper. Because every co-author is responsible for the content of that paper. I was at a conference one time in Europe when I was younger. And a senior professor was given a paper because a student couldn't go to the conference for some reason. He was given a paper. and we're all sitting there, you know, having an uneasy feeling by about the second, even the second, third slide, that something was wrong. And nobody wanted to say anything because we knew the professor, he was a reputable professor, we all respected him. It keeps going, and he gets to about the sixth slide. And finally somebody couldn't take it. They stood up in about the fourth row and said, Professor, on slide 2 you had an error, and everything you said since then has been wrong. And the professor clicks back a few slides and looks at it and says, you're right. The student must have been on drugs when he wrote this paper. And that's cool. I was appalled, because first of all, I knew the student, I knew the professor. But more important, he was trying to blame his co-author for an error. Your name's on that paper, you are responsible for the error. A legitimate response was, yes, we made a mistake. We will have to correct that. So have all your co-authors read the paper and sign off that they agree with it. Have a non-author read the paper. When I write a paper, by the time I get done with it, I'm tired of looking at it, and I'm proofreading it, but I'm really not proofreading anymore. My mind's already shut off. So I go to the next office and I say, Al, is it good to microwave engineer? We have you work on this? And Al, would you read this paper? And he reads it, he comes back and says, George, it's a good paper, but this paragraph is unclear, and I think you have an error over here. So I fix those, I make it clear, and then I submit the paper. It helps your papers. And finally, submit all your government and company forms. Because if you submit a paper and it's accepted, and it gets on the internet, we all have heard stories about things that go on the internet. They don't come down, do they? If it's embarrassing to you, fine. You have to put up with some embarrassment. But if you're finally, your patent lawyer at your company comes to you and says, my gosh, you just gave away trade secrets, you're going to cost us millions of dollars, you got to get that paper back, it ain't coming back. And even worse, if the lawyers for the company come back and say, my gosh, you just gave away top secret information, the government's going to arrest you, it ain't coming back. You're going to jail. So make sure you've gone through all the procedures. Submit your papers. Every society, every journal has the rules of how to do that on the internet sites. So you submit your paper, you get a letter back. This is a real letter I received back from one of my papers. It's rejection, as you can see. This paper was rejected in its current form. But we ask you to revise your manuscript. This was a good letter. I was happy to receive this letter. Yes, it was rejection, but it was inviting me to resubmit the paper. So, at that point, what you should do is look through every reviewer's comments, every editor's comments, and what I do is I take out a highlighter pen and I highlight the things that I have to change or can change. Things like, the fuel plots aren't interesting. Okay, fine. Nothing I can do with that. He's just patting me on the back saying, good job. But the next bullet says, but there needs to be more investigation of it. Okay, I highlight that. That's one thing I can look at. And I highlight everything else that has to be fixed. And then I spend maybe a month working with my co-authors, and we revise the paper to improve the things that the reviewers said needed to be fixed. And then I write a polite letter back to the editor and to the reviewers. And make sure it's polite. And they can explain what you revised. Now, what I highly recommend is you cut out the letter to you exactly what the reviewer wrote, and then your response, word for word, of how you addressed it. So that when your editor, or if it goes back to the reviewer can look to see how you responded to it. And if you don't agree with the reviewer's comments, if you think the reviewer didn't understand your paper, or maybe it was wrong, it's okay to write that in here. Say, I'm sorry, but I think you misunderstood the text of my paper. What I meant was this, or the concept is this, and you just didn't understand. That's okay if you truly believe that. But if you addressed it, explain how you addressed it. And then in the paper that you submit, the revised paper, highlight all the revisions. As an editor, I have a stack of papers on the floor, a couple hundred papers high, because I get 100 a month and it takes a long time to work on them. But if I get a paper that's a revised and resubmitted paper, that's all highlighted with all the changes, I can do that paper relatively quickly. It only takes me 20 minutes, half hour. That paper all of a sudden goes on my desk immediately. I don't put it on the pile. So that paper gets done quick. If you don't highlight it and I have to read the whole paper again to see what you changed, it goes on the pile. So, we're getting near the end. If your paper is rejected, don't take it personally. The reviewers the associate editors, the editors. Their only goal, besides publishing a paper, is to help you, to help the authors write a better paper, to improve the paper. And that's how you should interpret it, as suggestions to improve your paper. 80 to 50% of the papers submitted are going to be rejected. Our journals, the acceptance rate is about 25 to 30%. Solid state circuits, electronic devices, very similar. Some societies are about 40%. But really, we're all going to get rejection letters. I don't know anybody has never gotten a rejection letter. So don't take it personally. Try to fix the paper. If your paper is rejected, try to read all the reviewers' comments and then revise your paper. Now, don't just resubmit your paper without revising it. And don't think, okay, this journal rejected my paper, I'll just send it over there. When I was working earlier, I had a paper submitted via MTT transactions. And I thought it had some errors in it. And I read it, and again, it was on cold bend wave guide, but immaterial. It was on a microwave transmission line. And I wrote why I thought the paper needed to be fixed. I sent it to the editor. The editor got the reviews back from the other reviewers. The editor agreed that the paper should be rejected, and the paper was rejected. A month later, I got that same paper from the transactional electron devices. Why? It's not even within the scope of that journal, but I got the same paper. The author didn't change a thing. Didn't even fix the spelling errors I pointed out. So it was very easy for me to review your paper. I just cut my old review, pulled it out the door, and sent it to the editor. The editor rejected it again. I got that same paper a third time from a John Wiley publication. This time I didn't even bother. I just called up the editor who I knew. I said, this paper's been rejected twice by IEEE journals. The author hasn't changed a thing yet. Please tell this author not to submit it anymore. And that author got a very impolite letter saying, we never want to see your paper again. But this happens very often, though. If you try to game the system thinking, I'm going to submit my paper to 2 journals in parallel to save time, because the review process takes time, and maybe increase my odds of getting acceptance, because maybe one will accept it, even though the other rejected it, the odds are good that that paper will go to a same reviewer. And it happens about 4 times a year when I was editor. This happened. What happens at that point? Both editors reject your paper. Both editors tell you they never want to see that paper again. And if they really want to follow IEEE policies, they will send that case to IEEE, and then you may get banned from publishing. So that's a violation of IEEE policies. So conclusion. Remember, editors, reviewers look for reasons to reject your paper. Try not to give them an easy one. If you can get them to read the last line of your paper, you have a good chance of being accepted. Don't assume you can fix things in your paper when you resubmit it. Journals, I find that very rarely happens. Most people understand if they're going to submit a journal paper, they do the best they can. Sometimes conference papers, I often see them submitted, and the figures are a little bit sloppy, the text is incomplete. In fact, I'll even say things, measurements will be added when I submit the final paper. Those papers get rejected. Submit your final work. We're not going to assume that you're really going to fix it when you submit the final paper. Most editors, most journals like it when you write in the third person. I only know a few people who wrote their papers always in the first person. Arthur Allner, if you ever read his papers, they're often written in the first person. We accepted it from him. I mean, that was just his style. But, do I really need to write a paper saying, I fabricated the circuit by etching the copper board, and I measured it on a network analyzer, and I analyzed the data? It's your paper. We know I am the one who did it. You don't have to say that every sentence, so leave the I's out of papers. Acronyms. Oh, sorry. Acronyms. Do not use too many acronyms. It makes the paper hard to read. And don't overuse symbols and reuse symbols. Reusing symbols is the last thing you want to do. I was given a paper at NASA from a supervisor, and I said, help this person out. He wants to submit this paper. And it was very mathematical. I'm deriving all the equations to see if they're correct. And after about the 3rd page, I just threw up my hands. I said, I can't get any of these equations to work. I went and I talked to him. I said, I don't understand this. Well, he said, well, here beta means this, and over here beta means this. And alpha changed over here, and now it means this. I said, who can read a paper? Your own variable means the same thing from page 2 to say page 3. So don't do that. Finally, be patient. If you send me your paper, I get very irritated if 2 weeks later you send me an email saying, where's my reviews? In 2 weeks, my assistant may not even give me the paper yet. And I may not even gotten a chance to look at it yet. Typically, papers take 3 to 4 months to get your first decision. Some journals and IEEE take a year. Be patient. If I had the paper 5 months and you sent me an email, I would have written a polite email back saying, I'm sorry, we had a problem with one reviewer, we're still working on your paper. But if you sent it to me in 2 or 3 weeks, I ignored your email. I did not reply. So finally, I hate to end on a bad note, but IEEE has a banned authors list. Maybe some of you heard about this and you thought it was a rumor. It's not a rumor. If you violate policies, if you plagiarize a paper, if you make up data in a paper and you're caught, you will be banned from participating in publishing in IEEE journals, conferences. Could be 1 year, it could be life. Luckily, our society has been pretty good. We only had one person so far that's on this list. And unfortunately, it was a conference I was the chair of. And the paper was accepted, published. And don't think that this only happens in country X. This was a US company, a US author. And the paper was published at the conference. And about 6 months later, somebody was trying to find one of the co-authors written. He wanted to ask them questions. And he couldn't find it. He did an internet search, couldn't find this co-author existing anywhere. This person called up the company and said, I'd like to speak with this co-author, I have some questions. The company said, we don't know this co-author, never worked here. So that tipped off that something was wrong. And he asked IEEE to investigate. IEEE investigated. Not only did the corresponding author make up the co-authors, he made up everything in the paper. Yes, there was a schematic, there was a photograph, there was measured data, but it was all taken from different papers, fabricated, put together. The paper looked beautiful, the results looked good. There was a table comparing the results to prior works. Everything was there, it looked great, but everything was made up. That author is banned for life. So you don't want to get on that list. And so on that bad note, I'm done, and nobody asked questions while I was giving my talk, so I'll entertain any questions you have now.
Thanks very much. Let's give him a round of applause. Thanks very much, George. And for those of you who will be here for the next part of this, you will see much of these topics will be revisited in a completely different way. But just, pay attention, because I've been in this game for over 50 years. My first transactions paper was published in 1965, and I think what George had to say today was really incredibly comprehensive. I think you should really study this and restudy this, because there's a lot of gems here that you should take to heart. So with that, please ask questions. We have lots of time, and I will give you this microphone to help you. Who's going to ask the first question? Okay.
So my first question is, if you have a paper that's at a conference and they have the extension afterwards, how much new content needs to be in that paper for the extension?
All right, that's a good question. There was an editor at one time who never wrote it down, but he said in a meeting that he expected 60% new content. And that got to be publicized as what 60% was the minimum that was required. But that's really not true. What we look for is new content. So if you have a paper at a conference, you have 3 or 4 pages. You can't fully explain how a circuit works in 3 or 4 pages. So we would expect you to have a full explanation. Your conference paper may have some of the experimental results, but there wasn't room to have them all. Maybe you have a circuit and you publish the gain and the noise figure of it, but you didn't have time to work on the efficiency and so forth, put it all in one paper. So we would expect you to add that. Maybe you added further simulations. But there really is no golden rule. When I was an editor of the letters, I accepted a paper that was from the paper conference, and the letter's only 3 pages. And it was based on the conference paper, but the only thing she changed in the paper was 1 paragraph. Now, why was that important? Because when the author was given her paper at the conference, somebody from the audience told her that there was an error in her conclusions or what her conclusions were based on what she presented. And she went back and reworked it, and she corrected the conclusions. And that was critical because that changed the whole meaning of the paper. So we accepted the paper based on a what you would call a very minor change, but the technical content changed dramatically based on that. So there really is no golden rule, but as I said before, earlier in the talk, increasing the length of your introduction and adding more references will not do it. It's the middle of the paper that has to be greatly expanded.
Let me follow up on that, and I think this is something that's probably on everybody's mind. The idea of expanding a conference paper, let's say from 3 pages to 10. Now, I've experienced issues where my 3-page papers expanded to 10 apparently did not have enough new information. So that raises a kind of a paradox here. If 3 pages is equivalent to 10 in the terms of archival, why are 10-page papers published at all? When you get a paper that might result in a 10-page transactions paper, if that's equivalent to 3 pages, why not ask the authors to cut it down to 3?
Very good question. And sometimes reviewers will recommend reducing the length of a paper. So what happens is, when this happens, for example, when the reviewers look at a paper, even though the conference paper was 3 pages, if they believe the meaning and the significance and the understanding of the work was explained well in the 3 pages, expanding it to 6 or 10 pages, they will look at it and possibly say, no, even though you expanded it, you added a lot more theory. In the 3 pages, I understood it all, and this 10 pages is not required. Now, that's very hard for authors to accept sometimes, but that's when the editor and the reviewers are reading a paper, that's a judgment that they make. It may not always be right. And like I said before, if you give a paper rejected, it is within your rights to ask the editor to revise their recommendation for that paper. You as an author always have the right to question an editor. And that was half the job of the editor, was to answer these kind of emails from authors that were not happy with their decisions. But yes, there are times when reviewers will ask you to condense a paper down. It doesn't happen that often in our journals because we tend to write 7 to 8-page papers on average. But yeah, if you submit a 20-page paper, the odds are you will be told to cut it down to 10.
Any more questions from the audience?
Hi. You said something about people submitting papers to 2 different conferences simultaneously. Like, is that the rule? You're not allowed to do that or something?
It's not a rule. If you send it to 2 journals simultaneously, that's a policy. That's a violation. That can get you on the banned authors list. Conferences are not monitored by IEEE as closely, but in reality, I wouldn't do that anyway. I wouldn't recommend that. Yes, if you have similar but different content in the 2 conferences, you may do that. You may find a reason why submitting a paper to a circuits conference and sending that same circuit to a reliability conference, whereas at the reliability conference you talk about the mean time to failure of the circuit, Whereas at the circuit conference, you're talking about is performance. That's okay, because you're talking about two different aspects of that same circuit. But if you're just publishing the same results at two different conferences, personally, when I see that happen, you do a Google Scholar search, it's easy to see who they have, who's doing that. It looks bad, it gives you a bad reputation, so I don't recommend doing that. And there's a group out there, I don't know who they are, I really can't figure out who they are. But they keep reporting to us people who are doing that, and they give us the two conference papers, say this person publishing the same paper. And I typically doesn't know what to do with it because this person wants to not give their name, whoever's doing it. But it ruins your reputation, so I don't recommend doing that. Yes?
Does the IEEE prefer that equations be put right into the text, or the use of appendices to do the derivations and then just use the result in the paper?
Right.
What is the preference?
I don't really know if they have a preference. What I find is if the derivation of the equations would be very lengthy and was not germane to the topic of the paper, I think I, as an editor, would prefer to have seen that in appendix, the full derivation, and then just the final equation in the paper itself. But if the derivation was only 2 or 3 steps, put it right in the paper. So, because if you're reading a paper, it's hard to flip back to the appendices back and forth. So if it's a very short derivation, I would leave it in the paper itself. But like I said, if it's a long derivation that really was not the topic of the paper, just the final equation was used in the paper, I would prefer to see that in the appendices, and then that final equation then in the paper itself also.
I can soon now. There's one question about the policy. Some of the CAD papers, some of the authors, recently, in the last, I would say, year or year and a half, received with the revised recommendation to include measure. And that actually, and measure result was not really relevant to the, I'm sure some CAD paper measure results will be applicable, but many times it is not. And many times CAD authors, the measure result is comparing it with other methods on the computer, like our lab is computer. What do you think about that? I mean, how do you respond to the request? It usually comes not from the reviewer, it comes from the associate.
Yes, associate, yes. All right. If the topic of the paper is specifically on the development of a CAD method, the numerical method itself, ideally, measured results are not needed. You should compare it to another method. Maybe you want to compare it to one of the commercial methods, SINET or HFSS or whatever, but that should be sufficient. However, if the CAD method is specific to maybe the design of a filter, then they will often say you have to show the measured results. The difference is what is the sole purpose of the paper? Was it the development of the CAD method, or was it the development of the filter? If it's the development of the filter and the CAD method is how to define, or if the paper is on how to use the CAD method to design a filter, then they'll want to see the measured results for the filter. But if it's strictly on the development of the CAD method, then the filter measurements should not have been asked for. And again, that's it's up to the editors, and if that ever happens with you, you can try to explain to them why you thought in this case it wasn't required. But I use that example because as an editor, that was the example that came to me often. What is coming about now is system papers, big systems. And you can simulate a big system, but how many authors can afford to build a big system, a whole wireless system for a city? I mean, that's not something reasonable. So that's a debate we're having right now, is that a category that simulations alone should be sufficient for? And I think we're leaning down saying, yes, we can't expect an author to build a whole random system to demonstrate this. But if it's a filter and that's small and we think that it can be built, or an integrated circuit, or integrated circuits must be built, then we'll insist on the measured results. Again, no, if you're never happy with the editor's decision, and you don't think he made the right decision, you discuss it with them.
Yeah, but there is no policy here.
No, there's no
Because there is some of, okay, thank you. Misconception or rumor around for CAD people say, oh no, I'm not submitting to MTT because they're going to ask me for measurement.
Right.
And myself, I faced it only once, but that's it, you know. But there is this misconception, and you go to other journals and whatever, and they don't submit MTT specifically for that reason.
I fully understand that, I've heard that complaint many times, or comment many times. Yes, typically our journals will ask for measured results to confirm analysis. And it takes the editor, to make a courageous decision to accept a paper saying it's a CAD paper and not a CAD development paper and not a filter development paper. But then, again, there's really, it's like when I was talking about novelty or significance. I mean, how do you determine what's significant? It's up to the editor, and you can have a debate with the editor and try to convince them that your paper should be accepted and it really does not require measured results. But it's a decision that has to be made by the editor. I know a gentleman who works on noise, and he said, George, if somebody put down equations for the absolute minimum noise of a circuit, you know, it's a theoretical noise determination. How can you possibly build a circuit to test that? And you can't.
Or yield estimations.
You can't. So you have to accept that paper as a theory paper at that point and forget that it's really, the reviewers might have read it as a circuits paper about noise figure. You have to accept it as a theory paper about noise figure. And CAD is the same way. You have to convince them that.
You have the, I think,
Okay, one more. There
yeah,
are other
just,
burning questions.
what you're saying is great, but somehow the message has to go out to the authors, or potential authors, because what we're not seeing is the CAD content within the MTT transaction is going down, and as CAD people, we are not happy with that.
Right. Well, that's one reason why I give this talk. That's one reason why it's being going to be posted on the internet site. Hopefully people we can get the message out. But yes, there's misinformation that's been out there about our journals that we've been trying to solve, like the 60% increase in content. It's really not a policy. When you need measured results and when you don't. You know, it's something we have to understand as a community, and we have to try to get the message out. So we're trying, but we understand that there's perceptions that are out there, and we have to try and correct them.
I'll come back to that later on, believe, trust me, but I think we have a couple more questions here.
Thank you for the presentation. You talked a lot about content of the papers, but maybe you could help me. I'm planning to write an article to give me some tips in writing skills to help the editors. Things I'm thinking of, for instance, are having the first sentence of the paragraph the main message, and so on. So maybe
Okay. Yes. Yes, what you just said is a good idea. Each paragraph is supposed to be a different concept you're trying to get across, right? And it's very hard to read a paragraph that runs over a column length. So we try to avoid that. You know, your thoughts, each individual thought should be in a separate paragraph. And one way is like you said, the first line may give the concept of what's going to be in that paragraph, the thoughts that are going to be in that paragraph, and then the rest of the paragraph is about that. And if you get to the bottom, you go on to your next thought, that's a new paragraph. A really good thing to do is use Microsoft, if you use Microsoft Word, use the grammar checker and the spell checker. Now be very careful not to use it in the automatic mode. When you get all done with the paper, click the button to check and have it checked. It's pretty good about pointing out spelling errors and grammar errors. Help you making sure that the phrases are written correctly and you have complete sentences. But if you put it in the automatic mode, what happens is, who in here has made a lossy circuit? I mean, we all have, right? We have a circuit that has loss, and you'll see in presentations, a person will stand there and say, this circuit's lossy. Well, lossy is not in the English language. So Microsoft Word will change it. And I've seen it change to lousy, I've seen it change to loosey, and I never know what to change it to. But if you have it in the automatic mode and you're typing, you just keep going through, you're no longer describing a circuit about loss, you're describing a circuit that has lace. So be careful not to use the automatic mode. Again, your introduction, I explained how to write. And in the rest of your technical content, break it into sections, the experimental method, the derivation equations, the results, and then the conclusions. And that'll help the reader. And again, I think the biggest help is to have somebody who did not read or write your paper with you read it. That is always the biggest help for me. Because English is my first language, my only language. I've been trying to teach myself German for years now, and I can't do it. But even me, when I read a paper, or I read a paper, and I'm proofreading it, at that point my mind is shut off. I'm not really reading it anymore. I always go to Al or Sam or somebody and have them read my paper and help me get it in the right language. That's probably the biggest tip I can give.
Yeah, I'll actually come back to that later on. Take a course in creative writing. I'll come back to that in my talk later on. Then you'll find out how to write paragraphs. Yeah.
Thanks very much. You had a slide on getting company approvals for proprietary information, any government stuff. You're experiencing that, so I'm sure you've been through much of that. And so through that process, it's easy to have things removed to where all of a sudden it's no longer relevant, or is maybe not worth publishing. At the point all these things get taken out, and it can be very subjective how to go through that. But I'm wondering if you have any comments, tips for people in the companies that are developing stuff on how to get it published and also get through the approval.
All right, yes. Yeah, and it's very sad that we've seen a large drop-off in industry publishing journals and at conferences. And they have a harder time because whereas universities want to publish and they have no problem explaining everything to the world, industry likes to maintain their secrets so they can sell products. So what as an industry does, and universities do the same thing. Let's say, example, you're discussing how to build a transistor. And you give the doping profile, and you give the metal stack, and you give the metal, the thicknesses of the metals and the types. And then you say, and then it's annealed. Now, we're not going to have you specify the exact anneal temperature, and you may not give the exact conditions that the metals were sputtered at. You may just say we sputtered on the metals. We all understand why that was held back, but by just simply saying it was annealed, but you've given the author or readers the metal stack, good practicing engineers, if they want to spend the time, could duplicate the results because they could sputter the metals on, and they can make a matrix of anneal temperatures and anneal times and spend a year or two in the lab doing that. But we will not insist that you give us the exact temperature of the exact metal. I just use that as an example. but we do get some, we still want to get industry papers, and it's possible to do it without giving up the company secrets. But it's a little bit harder. I don't know, I probably didn't answer your question fully, because you probably wanted the exact outline of what you can leave out, what you have to include, and it's hard for me to do.
It's very subjective.
It is, it's very subjective. But basically, if you have enough in there that at least the person can understand the paper fully, and if they really want to spend their time and money, they can duplicate your results. That should be sufficient.
Well, we have time for another question before coffee.
So we've been talking about paper for journals, but my question relates to abstracts related to fellowship applications. You know, when you don't have actual measured data, you're sort of saying, we're going to do this, we've got simulated data. Should the focus and emphasis kind of be more on the novelty? Do you have any tips and suggestions?
On fellow applications, IEEE fellows?
Fellowships?
Oh, fellowships for students.
Right.
Okay. I'm probably not the best person here because I'm not an academic. So I really don't have a feeling. And I've read some, I've written one as a reference, but I don't have a feeling for what the review boards at the university really look for. So I'm sorry, I can't help you with that one.
Well, thanks. Maybe one quick question here, and then we should probably have coffee.
You talked about plagiarism, but is there sometimes an honest mistake, like reading so many papers and sometimes you miss an important reference or you drew a picture, a figure when you find out it was already there in some other way?
Yeah, plagiarism is tricky. Every paper you submit to IEEE gets checked through a plagiarism checker. Every paper submitted to a journal, it automatically goes to a plagiarism checker. So you submit a paper, and it gets compared to tens of thousands of papers. And it looks for sequences of words that are the same. And IEEE is going to start doing that for every conference paper also. So the editor, though, they get this report back, and they'll say 30% of this paper is plagiarized. And I'll read it, and it's really not 30%. I mean, if you would say a filter has a return loss, that's 5 words. Every paper on filters has that sentence in there, but that comes up as a plagiarized sentence. So the editor looks and says, nah, that's, ignore that. So it's a subjective thing. Now, to address your actual question though, what happens if I was to write a paper in German? I mentioned I'm trying to teach myself German. I don't know how to write German well, but I'm struggling to write a paper in German. What am I going to do? I'm going to read a lot of German journals, and I'm going to say, oh, this author wrote what I'm trying to say very well. So I may paraphrase it and use some text that's similar to that. And as an editor, I understood that if people are writing a language, language is not their native language. And I saw that that's what they were really trying to do. I let that slide. I'm not copying word for word, but if sequences of words were similar, I understood what the author was trying to do. As long as the work is novel, the work is new, the figures and everything, I understood that. And most editors, I think, try to understand that. But it's going to be harder now because if every conference runs through this plagiarism checker, reviews for conferences go so fast that it's going to be very hard for somebody to sit down and say, these were honest mistakes that the author made, or these were blatant attempts to plagiarize. And so I think more papers are going to get flagged because of that, because they don't have to spend the time. But it was something I had to spend the time with on every paper to see if I truly thought the author had made an honest mistake, or was trying to write a paper in a language that English was not their first language, and they were trying really hard, and it was just an honest mistake because of that. I let that slide. That's not plagiarism. But again, every IEEE editor, every IEEE conference organizer may look at it different.
But that's a great point to stop the morning. session on. We should have a quick coffee break and then come back for the second half. So let's thank George. A really great presentation. I think there's a lot of original material here that I heard today, at any rate, and I think this will be well worthwhile. And please come back in about maybe no more than 20 minutes. We should get going again. Thanks so much.
I think you definitely want to come back, because he's more excited than I am.
Yeah, I promise you some excitement. And hold some of those questions, ask me some of the questions that are still burning.